Hello and welcome. I am your host, Casimir Basilius of the Grand Dimensional Empire, and very shortly we will begin our lore video. I just have to make a quick check that everything is working, and it appears so. So, without further ado, let's, go over one quick thing, then we'll begin. This was attempted once before, but we had severe technical errors about 20 minutes in. Like severe technical errors. So hopefully this time that won't happen. Now, this is, I have a list of information we're going to go over, but it's better if I actually start with it. Here we go. Hello, and welcome to our lore series, where we cover the background details of Galactic Requiem. In this series, I gather all of the basic data of a subject and go somewhat in-depth in its workings. Today, we will be covering FTL, or faster than light travel, in Galactic Requiem. We will be covering several topics off my script here, and going onto side topics, but we'll be trying to keep our ramblings to a minimum, as this series is more about making sure we cover the majority of the basic information of lore on topics. So, let's start. Well, as soon as we fix that. That was not ideal. It was actually telling me that I'm supposed to start this right now. Well, let's actually get to it. Here we are. So, we're covering FTL, or faster than light travel. As with many reality, we are generally bound to the fact that we cannot move faster than light. This, however, mostly applies to real space. Of course, there are a few exceptions. Now, where did it all begin? The first non-ancient FTL drive was developed in 112.012.259.658, or 112,012,249,658. And over the next 1,211 years, by 112.012.250.869, or 112,012,250,869, FTL was discovered by all known major nations. Of course, given the way we measure the calendar, we usually abbreviate the year to the last 4 numbers. So, in this case, it doesn't work due to the fact that the course that FTL was developed in switches from, 249,658 to 250,869, but that's not too important here. During this time, alternate layers of space were discovered by many of the non-ancient nations. These alternate layers of space were then used to create the wide variety of FTL methods we know today. These include subspace, slip space, hyperspace, jump space, and more. Warped space was also discovered, however, it's not a layer of space, and discovered is, it's a complex term for it. More so invented in that time. It's a complicated term. Anyway, more so it escapes me than it's complicated. Let us cover the most common methods of FTL. These methods are generally placed into 2 categories: drives and gates. Sorry, rearranging my data file here. Drives and gates. Drives being mobile devices attached to an object moving through FTL. Gates being immobile or stationary devices that move an object without a drive through FTL. Do note that an object or ship traveling through a gate still needs FTL field shielding, but not necessarily a drive. Generally, both drives and gates share similar options or methods, as we will call them. There are the most common methods. There then are the most common methods of FTL, the layered space drives. Each layer cannot interact with any other layer, and each layer has a variety of sublayers. For instance, the base layers of space are hyperspace, subspace, and slipspace in order, being rated as above, below, and between. Hyperspace being above, subspace being below, and slipspace being between. And to reiterate what was mentioned above, a ship in hyperspace can fire upon another ship in hyperspace. However, a ship in hyperspace cannot fire upon a ship in subspace or slipspace, etc. The same applies to real space. A ship in hyperspace cannot shoot at a ship in real space, etc., etc. The only time this does not really apply, which we might cover again later, but the only time this doesn't apply is warp space. Warped space is real space, just with a warped field of space around it. So a ship in real space can shoot a ship in warp, and a ship in warp can shoot a ship in real space. However, the warp field is damaging, and we'll get to that when we get to effects of FTL on people and objects. So, in short, well, that's still not entirely accurate. There's lots of exceptions. For instance, technically, it is possible for a ship in real space to fire a, say, FTL-linked weapon, a subspace specifically linked weapon, into subspace, or a slipspace weapon into slipspace, or a hyperspace weapon into hyperspace. Technically, you can do so, but basically that weapon is then entering that area, that layer of space. So technically you're not interacting with it from the layer that it's not. You have to interact on the layer it's in. So it doesn't like break the rules of physics of how it works. It's just the terminology we use in saying each layer cannot interact with any other layer, of course, has slight, specifics in meaning. The phrasing of that's not the best, basically. You can fire a subspace-enabled weapon into subspace because it's enabled in subspace, but that weapon's not going to affect something in real space because it would shift into the alternate layer, just for clarification's sake. Okay. Now that we've made that more complex than it needs to be in explanation, here we were. There are additional layers of space other than hyperspace, subspace, and slipspace. However, they are far rarer, or far more rare, to be more grammatically accurate, I believe, in your language. So we shall not cover them here. Layered spaces, well, other than warped space, but that's not a layer, and jump space, which we will cover. But look, I should just not go off on these tangents, because we'll just cover it as they come along. There are additional layers, however we will not cover them here. Layered spaces are similar to each other in effect. The ship or object transiting into a layered space disappear from real space and enter the layer that its drive can take it to. This layer, while in this layer, it may interact with any other ship on the same layer as it, usually. There are, as stated, different sublayers, and things can get a bit complicated, but this is a basic explanation of FTL. We're not here to go into the intricacies. I'm not here to tell you the variances, the layers, the actual mathematic calculations behind it. We're here to cover the basics, just so you can understand the law. So, we're already off to a terrible start with our tangents, aren't we? This is why we should stick to the script, but I think it's good to go on these slight tangents. So, in a layer, it may interact with any other ship on the same layer as it. Then there is jump space, which is similar to layered space, and even some scientists consider it to be a different layer. However, it generally receives its own classification due to its unique nature and drives. Jump space is far more dangerous, unstable, and hostile to all things. However, transit through jump space only lasts 1 second or less. There are no known reports of a successful jump where the object has taken more than 1 second in transit. Unlike other FTL drives or gates where transit time comes into effect, jump space methods require recharge before they may be used again. This usually ranges from 1 hour for the shortest jumps in the same system to 7 days for the longest jumps of 1,000 light years. Due to jump space being an unusual FTL method, it is generally rated as times 0.2 as its FTL speed. This makes it one of the fastest, but also one of the most dangerous methods of FTL achieved by the modern nations. We'll get into what FTL ratings mean further on. There is also warped space, which is a pocket of manipulated real space. Unlike any of the layered space drives, warped space allows movement at FTL speeds in real space. This is done by producing a bubble of warped space around the object. This bubble somewhat safely allows matter to enter and exit, thus allowing interaction with real space. Now, let us describe the different devices of FTL. As we have talked about the base methods, it is important to note that there are a wide variety of actual drives, gates, or devices that operate in varying manners. Gates are the most common form. They are two large devices. Well, common is debatable. They're basically the most common form. A gate system is two devices at point A and point B, usually at the end of an FTL lane, which we'll cover later. That's simply, these gates simply shift a ship into and out of the method of FTL the gate has. For safety reasons, these gates usually only activate as needed for transit. However, there are variants that maintain connection. These maintained gates are usually more expensive to produce and run, and they require additional constant shielding and energy. Due to the physics of FTL drives, maintaining a portal to a layered space requires vastly more energy than simply opening a portal for a short amount of time, for the short amount of time it takes a ship to transit into the layer. There are also risks involved in maintaining an open portal, as the physics of layered space differ from our own. These risks generally range in that of a Class 6 heavy weapon. And we're not going to cover, well, we'll cover what that means. It's not in script, but might as well get you a better understanding of what that means, other than just Class 6 heavy weapon. Well, we'll give it one shot. If this file opens without exploding, then we'll cover it. If the file does not decide to open, then we'll skip it. Ooh, we are in luck. The file has decided to work. Here we are. A Class 6 heavy weapon is on equivalent to what we would consider a weapon that has the destructive, not total destructive potential, but it's difficult to explain. Not really damage output, but sort of damage output of a singularity. As in, it likely destroys what it hits. But in short, basically, the classes of weapons are your average Class 1 heavy weapons, which are just really large weapons, let's be honest. Sometimes they have some special effects. I mean, it's just a class. Class 2 heavy weapons are equivalent to what you would consider a fission weapon or a nuclear weapon of the fission variety. A Class 3 heavy weapon is likely what you would consider a fusion weapon or a fusion-based nuclear device. A Class 4 heavy weapon is on par with a plasma device. A Class 5 heavy weapon is on par with a antimatter device, and a Class 6 heavy weapon is on par with a singularity device. There are, of course, higher. There's Class 7, 8, Class 9, and Class 10 heavy weapons. But we will not cover those for now. We're just getting you a good understanding of what that means. Of course, the radius of the device is not measured in its destructive potential or class, just the amount of damage achieved. Usually in regards to hitting shields or large objects. For instance, of course, a nuclear weapon will likely put a hole in whatever it hits due to the sheer magnitude of force released by a fusion weapon. A plasma weapon, Class 4, usually has a bit more power. An antimatter weapon, more power. A singularity weapon, more power, and so forth. Now, while of course the object hit is more likely just simply going to cease existing due to the sheer forces, there are still magnitudes of power released at the direct impact point. Anyway, drives. FTL drives are the most common form of FTL travel in the galaxy. Wait. I misread my script, which is why I was confused earlier. The most common form of gate are two large devices at point A and B. Drives are the most common form of FTL. I messed up by saying gates were the most common form of FTL and then got confused earlier. My apologies. The most common form of gate being point A to point B, but there being other forms of gate, the most common form of FTL being drive. Okay, now that we've fixed our error, FTL drives are devices built into a starship that allow it to enter and exit FTL on its own. Generally, an FTL drive is heavily integrated into a starship during its construction due to the safety requirements of FTL shielding and the calculation needed to shift into FTL. While there are forms of FTL drives that you can extend the field of and so forth, it is not recommended. FTL is dangerous. We'll get into that later. But normally, an FTL drive is heavily built into the actual construction of a vessel and not usually something you can simply swap or extend and so forth. Now, let us cover FTL lanes and transit. FTL methods allow a ship to shift into FTL. However, it is by no means a safe thing. Weather or FTL variance and constantly shifting fields and distortions cause FTL to be rather unpredictable. Error rates of FTL range from 5% to 50% or worse, depending on distance, method, and circumstance. This is where FTL lanes come into the picture. FTL can be temporarily mapped, and the route generally lasts for a few hours to a few weeks, depending on calculation capability and the shifts of FTL. Lanes are mapped routes held open by devices that constantly maintain a stable and clear path between 2 points, usually no more than 18 light years apart from each other. There are, however, longer distance gates. A stable FTL and technically longer distance lanes, but usually no more than 18 light years apart from each other. A stable FTL lane with proper shift calculation ensures a safe FTL transit with nearly no chance of failure, as long as the weather, or FTL variance, is stable. FTL lanes are the backbone of civilization and interstellar nations, arteries of trade throughout civilized space. It's not like they're needed. Well, I mean, practically they are, given the error chance, but you can FTL without lanes. It's just not recommended. Here we go. Due to the safety of lanes and the error rates without them, checkpoints and defenses are often placed at the ends of FTL lanes. We might cover this section twice because I forget if it's in the list of things that we are to cover, so I'll cover it here. FTL lanes are usually generated about 100 to 200 AU out from a system star, and or 50 AU further out if there is an object that distance out of importance, then it's 50 AU further out than that. How does a ship enter FTL? A ship uses calculations to modify its FTL drive to work against the forces of FTL. Without these calculations, or if they fail, a ship will usually simply fail to enter FTL. On success of these calculations, a ship's drive is able to properly enter the FTL method it has. For hyperspace, slipspace, and subspace, this is usually achieved by the ship simply fading into FTL. This isn't always the case, but for your average drives, it appears as such. The area that can enter FTL is usually the direct adjacent area within a ship's shields or FTL field. However, other drive types and ways to enter FTL exist. Warp drives, on success, simply generate a warped space bubble around their vessel. Jump drives, almost instantaneously, generate a distortion, and pull the ship into it. Well, as stated, for simply a second before the ship arrives. FTL calculation is generally done with a computer. However, it is possible to manually calculate a shift into FTL. However, this is not recommended. Generally, FTL calculation is about 6 or so, 5 to 6 seconds for a ship to calculate, well, for a computer to calculate a shift into FTL, and about 5 or so seconds for a ship to actually shift into FTL. Technically, you can calculate slower. And this, I mean, it provides a more sure calculation. There's different methods and all that. Anyway, let's get to the fun bit. What if you entered FTL without a ship? Exposure to FTL. Well, let's start with warp. Passing through a warp field subjects you to, well, a field of warped space. Space not doing the right things. This generally is considered detrimental to your health. Luckily, due to the way warping space works with the physics of our galaxy, it is technically survivable. Technically. If you're unshielded, what happens is you'll basically hit with the equivalent of a 20 mil. So technically survivable, but you know, like the majority of people are not going to survive taking a 20 mil, you know? Like it's not a recommended experience. It's like saying it's survivable. Yeah, you could technically, I suppose, survive getting hit by a 20 millimeter round, I guess. So, you know, but it's not recommended to pass through a warp field unshielded. You also, well, as it warps space, you will also have internal damage in addition. Not only the internal damage caused by the equivalent forces of being hit by a 20 mil, but additional internal damage on top of that. So, you know, not recommended. Exposure to subspace, slip space, and hyperspace is very similar to each other. It's basically the same, slightly worse. As in, well, you take a lot more. The difference being, well, specifically, if you pass through, well, it's not really pass through. In this case, it's being in. If you are unshielded in subspace, slip space, or hyperspace, you're being subjected to, well, surprisingly, less damage than you would be passing through a warp field, but it's slowly, well, it's an alternate layer of space with altered physics. You will deteriorate, both internally and externally, constantly for as long as you are exposed to subspace, slip space, or hyperspace. Technically, it's more survivable than passing through a warp field, like, technically. Also, if you are exposed to subspace, slip space, or hyperspace, you will likely gain severe radiation sickness, which not recommended, You'll probably die from that. I mean, luckily we have the technology to cure that to a degree, but it's not a pleasant experience, you know? I mean, I say it's more survival. It's also near guaranteed death. I mean, you might survive. Exposure to jump space? No. I want to quickly, because I don't have it listed in front of me, do a quick bit of math. Okay, yeah. So, exposure to jump space immediately causes the equivalent to being hit by a 100 millimeter tank round every few seconds. Yes. So not survivable? Probably. I mean, yeah. very much, very much not survivable. Oh, let's be fair. I'm contemplating here. Could I survive that? Not something I want to test. Of course, being a genetically modified super soldier, the standard Terran biology, and I probably would not want that to happen. I don't think even I could withstand that. It's not ideal. So, like a super soldier's probably gonna have a hard time with that too, assuming they're not in armor, you know? An unshielded object or creature exposed to jump space also takes degradation damage, as it will also be affected to the rigors of alternate reality layers, and will also gain severe radiation sickness. And of course, this is every few seconds. So, you know, it is technically possible to survive exposure to jump space. Like, it's not like it's guaranteed getting hit by a 100 millimeter tank round, you know? It is, there are fluctuations and so forth in what occurs. So there are theoretically, there is theoretically the possibility to survive a second of exposure to jump space. But I mean, you know, let's be honest here. I say exposure to jump space causes you that much damage every so often, but nobody or anything has survived being in jump space for more than a second for other reasons. This is under the assumption that you simply are exposed to jump space for a second. Because any more than that, you're probably not succeeding to jump, and you're probably dead anyway. But, I mean, technically, put on a full set of Imperial powered armor, you could probably survive that, even the worst that 1 second of jump space can apply to you. You'll probably survive the worst of it if you're wearing hell, not even Imperial powered armor. If you're wearing any set of powered armor, you might be fine, like absolutely fine. I wouldn't recommend trying it, but you know, you do you. You do you. Now, FTL speeds. Oh, if you want to know, like, what happens if you pass through a gate, nothing. Like, exposure to FTL is based on the type of FTL, not the type of drive. So, well, device used. So, passing through a gate has no detrimental effect unless you pass through, say, like, passing through a subspace gate does not have a different effect than exposure to subspace, etc., etc. I suppose passing through a warp gate does, because you'd be passing through a warp field. But I'm not sure that warp gates exist. It's just not, I mean, if they do, it's not a technology I'm familiar with. I mean, I could check the Imperial databanks. Like I said, there's lots of actual ways of FTL. Like there's this one nation up north with FTL lane generators that, not FTL lanes, but basically they sort of slingshot a vehicle or ship more so through FTL in a corridor, and then they drop out of that corridor and can theoretically re-enter that corridor. It's a rather strange technology. It's not like it's beyond the Empire or anything. It's just there are methods of FTL that differ from the standard ones. But the basic laws of physics still apply, being you can't travel faster than light in real space. Well, as stated, warp field, but that's generating a field around your ship that's warping space. You see, like, it all works. There's certain underlying laws that are followed within each of them. Now, FTL speed. The standard FTL speed measurement are listed in times number. This is calculated via number times distance traveled in light years equals hours. Example, warp times 3, traveling 137 light years, is 411 hours of transit. So, as you can see, that's basically it. If you were traveling subspace times 1 for 137 light years, that's 137 hours, etc., etc. However, there are, times 0.1 or times 0.5, in which case it's done the same. You simply times by 0.5. 1 second. My apologies. Here we are. My apologies about that. And nope, here we are. Generally, FTL ranges from the lower range of times 384, or 1 light year every 16 days, to times 0.01, or 1 light year every 0.6 minutes. However, those numbers represent archaic and ultra-advanced variants. Your average FTL drive is usually 1, just times 1. However, there are slower and faster. Usually your average FTL drive's slowest is like times 12. And usually your fastest is like times 0.5, not counting jump drives. Archaic, of course, being times 384, and ultra advanced being times 0.01. There are faster and slower, even than that, but those are not really relevant because the majority of space don't have faster than times 0.01. But I mean, the majority also doesn't have slower than times 384, but it's possible to find slower. Like you can find slower. Slower drives, here it specifically states, slower FTL drives do and can exist. However, it's usually easy to bring a drive up to times 384 if it's, worse than that. It's real easy to bring a drive up technologically wise to times 384 at the least. As for faster drives, theoretically it's possible to go faster than times 0.01. However, no such drive exists. Okay? Good. To achieve speeds beyond 0.01, jump drives are used. Trust me, you do not want to shift into the layers of FTL. You know how I said there were sublayers? Do not shift into sublayers of FTL that are beyond 0.01. Don't do it. Just don't. Okay? So, if you want to do that, use a jump drive. It's safer. However, the risks of jump space apply, as does jump space drives' recharge times, noting that see our section on jump drives being the most dangerous form of FTL travel. Yes, they are safer than traveling faster than times 0.01. There are certain, well, no. Just don't go to layers that allow you to go faster than that. The standard FTL speeds used by the majority of nations fall around times 6 to times 0.5, with the average military ship having a rating of times 1 and the average civilian ship having a rating of times 2 to times 3. FTL drives and gates have an exceptionally hard time working near planets, stars, asteroid fields, or large objects due to the little understood instability of these objects that these objects cause in FTL fields. While it is possible for drives and gates to work near or on such objects, the dangers involved are great. Specifically, being you can't stabilize FTL near those areas. It just simply won't stabilize. Now, the reason it is possible to have a FTL drive, not FTL gate in orbit around a planet. It's also technically possible to FTL into orbit of a planet or even in a planet's atmosphere. All this is possible. It's just, it's not possible to stabilize an FTL route in addition to the other dangers involved. It's just, there's no lane, therefore you're going to have problems. Here we are. While it is possible for a ship to enter FTL theoretically anywhere, even in atmosphere, the lack of FTL lanes and the instability of FTL fields in those areas make it dangerous for a vessel to do so. Now let's talk about FTL weather or variance. Sorry about my translator. It indicates that weather is the best word, but I have the feeling that it isn't. FTL weather, or variance as it is called, is actually just the loose terminology of the various disruptive effects of FTL variance that naturally occur. FTL is considered to have these variants as it is not a stable thing. FTL weather or variance can affect travel and communications. FTL variance usually changes monthly. However, it has on rare occasion changed daily, weekly, or even yearly. Usually it doesn't change more than daily. However, it is possible for it to happen even slower than that. I mean, quicker than that, hourly. It's possible. It's just not really, there are no there are technically probably recorded events of it. It's just not common. Exceptionally not common. So, of course, there's clear, lightly clouded, moderately clouded, heavily clouded, etc., etc. FTL storms, FTL clouding, FTL instability, and FTL disruption. Each with different severity that cause different effects. For instance, lack of communications, increased travel time, harder calculation, increased chance of FTL mishap, guarantee that there will be a chance of FTL mishap, increased FTL mishap severity, and then just the inability to FTL or communicate. I say communicate and that communications can be disrupted. Generally, this is FTL-based communications or linked comms. Technically, linked comms use FTL to communicate. Of course, radio doesn't stop working, neither does laser comms, just generally faster than light comms are disrupted by such things. And this can bleed into real space, which can cause problems. Also, FTL variance or weather can happen generally on, well, a sector scale. It can be a singular light year to a large portion of a sector, which is never ideal. Anyway, FTL failure. FTL failure occurs when you try and do something non-standard with FTL, like not using an FTL lane. Generally, FTL failure happens. There are multiple FTL failure chances for every so often that a ship is doing non-standard variant FTL. This can be as simple as your trip taking longer. But it can also damage your ship, or just outright destroy your ship, or you can be lost to FTL. It is not recommended to do. However, that doesn't stop militaries from attempting so. Well, it just doesn't always stop them from attempting it to gain tactical advantage. However, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. We talked about exposure. What else is there? I suppose let's have a quick visual. For instance, if you want to know what an FTL there we go. Now you can see what an FTL lane network looks like. The blue lines between the purple system indicators gives you an idea of what FTL lanes look like. A webbing between civilized systems that have generated FTL lanes. There are many FTL lanes from early FTL colonization that still exist and are maintained to this very day because they're valuable arteries, but there are areas of space with lacking lanes and lacking webs. For instance, these worlds here, as you can see, lack connections to a lot of places. You're stuck in a line. There are some places in which there are simply no lanes between sections, like there and there. In this instance, you could go around. Can't even go there. You have to go all the way around, But it does prevent a lot of travel to certain areas, as it is a risky prospect, given the dangers of FTLing non-standard. I think I mentioned that, yes, we did. We mentioned that you want most civilizations have the FTL lanes at the outside of this is about 100 to 200 AU out from their star or 50 AU out from the furthest stellar object. And generally that area usually is considered a free transit around your star system, usually. Different governments have different laws, but we're not here for any of that. I believe that, for the most part, concludes our FTL episode, in which we've covered the majority of the basics of FTL. I hope you now have a better understanding of the way FTL works in Galactic Requiem, and the difficulties and benefits we have of using it here in our galaxy. Thank you all for stopping by. As usual, I've been your host, the Imperial Lord, Casimir Basilius, and I hope you have a wonderful day.